You know, I really have to thank our Halo for continually tantalizing me with the prospect of pointless arguments and the eternal nagging sense of futility and pure dread at clicking that little orange envelope. Because if they didn't, I'd probably be leading the dull, boring existence of someone without dangerously high blood pressure and cortisol levels, and sadly it's gotten to the point where I just can't maintain an erection without shaking my girlfriend's shoulders and screaming,
"Your Halo is fucking garbage!"
I'm just kidding. I don't have a girlfriend. But it is curious that our Halo has become the new Waypoint, which had become the new Bungie.net, which makes it the most recent successor in a storied lineage of community laughingstocks who steadfastly believe that to levy legitimate criticisms against the Halo series is to levy a direct criticism on the size of their penises. Oh, but I can see the sweat beading on your forehead right now as you ferociously wipe the snot on your shirt and say, "No, Lemon, we upvote every criticism that's civil and respectful." To which I would ask, hey friend, I know you're ready to send complaints about wanting more rec points for less effort right to the top of the sub, but when's the last time that a post about Halo 5's shitty core sandbox, no matter how tame and friendly, actually ended up with a positive rep count? Seems to me that it hits Reddit lore masters in a far, far deeper place than myself when exposed to the idea that Halo 5 isn't the deepest, most skillful Halo game that's ever been released. Skill. Depth. Are these more nebulous terms than we believe? Probably not to your average annoying subjectivist, but after a particularly fruitless endeavor arguing with the wounded hearts of our Halo, I started doing some thinking on the matter. I'm the sort of person who stresses working definitions. That is to say, I like to give meaning to certain terms in such a way that when speaking in an agreed upon context, they provide the greatest amount of useful distinction. If you took this straight up spin alley, you could probably say that I just don't give a thrusting fuck about your definition of the term, but contrary to what you may have heard, I don't lay awake in bed at 3 a.m. every night just thinking of ways to make arguments with Halo fans on the internet more convoluted and stupid. I speak and form ideas in the way that I do because if one measly person in this universe were to practice the principle of charity, they would understand that I'm only looking out for Halo's best interest. I actually have a very utilitarian idea. I'm sorry, do you actually know what that word means? If not, just go look it up. A utilitarian idea of how Halo games should be designed. I just also happen to have a very strong opinion on which part of the community has been getting the shaft for the last decade. Yeah, your 5 months without infection and griffball is my year plus of broken MCC, and 10 years without a decent competitive Halo, so ask me if your interests are usually at the front of my mind. So yeah, working definitions. When I'm discussing something in the framework of concepts that don't have an established foundation to them, I like to, well, establish them. On a foundation. Perhaps you might not agree with the foundation I'm laying down, perhaps we might never fully agree there, but these are just placeholders for a greater idea that I'm trying to convey, and you are perfectly welcome to tear them down, as long as you can do a better job of building them back up again. It's always far easier to shoot down a Banshee than it is to build one of your own, or something. The point is that if you're just here to leave a dismissive comment and a dislike, keep this in mind. Varg Vikernes is an unabashed racist and a murderer who put out some of the worst music of all time in the Burzum albums, and even he's contributed more to society than you have. So just file that away for the next time you start to feel good about yourself, okay? I hate you. All that said, the problem here arises when we look at the Halo series as a whole and try to determine at which point it was the deepest and most skillful. And to make any headway on the subject, we have to hammer out what we believe is the most cogent and applicable definition of either of these terms. Between the two, I think the most agreement can be had on the concept of skill because it hints towards something more concrete and basic. To say that a game is skillful is certainly said with context given to other comparable games, but what is a video game skill? What is a skill in general? The Webster definition reads as the ability to do something that comes from training, experience, or practice, whereas the Oxford definition reads as something you'll never have, you fucking casual, but I think we can do better than that and be more respectful of the given subject matter. If I were to try to come up with a working definition of the term skill as it applies to video games, it would be something like the recognizably controlled input of the player onto both his vicar and his enemies and/or environment, executed with precision as to directly affect the outcome of short-term engagements, as well as the mental proficiency to plan ahead in a manner clearly showing the processing of both patterns and real-time information, as to further extend his or her influence over the match. Do you disagree with my assessment of the idea of skill? Well, fuck you, because it's a working definition. Its purpose is to mete out an idea in a way that does not blur or overlap with any other concepts that have their own clear distinctions in such a way as to create definitional gray areas. For example, if it's a skill, it's not part of the meta. That's the complete fucking opposite definition of the word meta, you stupid bastards. Stop saying meta! What becomes a little more difficult thereafter is determining which gameplay aspects actually fit the criteria of a skill. Yet it's not too harrowing when we try to use our working definition, which can be broken down further into physical skills and mental skills, both of which require their own working definitions. If a physical skill involves the actual tactile input of the player onto the controller, then the simplest example of a solely physical skill is aiming. And this is also a good example of why working definitions are useful, if not necessary. It would be very easy and wildly infuriating to say, well, hey, reacting to information on screen requires mental processing, so aiming has to also be a mental skill as well. But in what way does that further our understanding of these phenomena from a reductionist perspective? Oh, I'm sorry, is that another word that you don't know? Well, go ahead, look it up. Here, I'll even pause the video for you. Okay, fuck you, it's been long enough. To say that aiming has a mental component is to provide us with no useful framework for further discussion. You can split hairs until you're bald by debating whether reaction time is a physical or a mental aspect. You just won't get anywhere. The fact of the matter is that the mental requirements for aiming your gun in a video game are 1. Be alive, and 2. Don't be on Kevorkian's waiting list. From there, it's up to your fingers and your nervous system to do the work. A working definition is not a way to sidestep conflict nor to call intellectual high ground, but simply a pragmatist's way of being conciliatory by saying, look, this is clearly 99% one thing and 1% the other thing. I'm just gonna go with the 99% and keep moving forward toward a fuller understanding of what we're dealing with that can be applied in practice. So aiming is a physical skill. What about a mental skill? Timing weapons would be a fair idea of a Halo mental skill, more specifically the mental ability to approach and manipulate the area around spawning power items, as well as harass enemies in a way that maximizes the potential to come out on top and grab the rewards. Assuming that this enemy has roughly equal physical talents to you, a 50-50 Western shootout is simply not the smartest way to approach, so a player must learn to bait and switch his opponent or gauge said opponent's behaviors in order to defeat them. This is especially important in Halo when compared to other traditional arena FPSs like Quake, since unlike Quake, Halo's movement is cripplingly slower and less dynamic. Even with all the frilly bullshit they added to Halo 5, a well-timed rocket jump is not only more skillful with a far greater risk-reward gap, it's also more expedient and changes the game style considerably. Ergo, a huge amount, if not the vast majority, of Halo's mental competition involves crafting on-the-run approaches to securing the power items. There's a lot more to this in CE than any other Halo, but I'll spare you filthy Halo heathens the CE evangelism and try to refrain from spreading the good word of our Lord and Savior M6 Jesus. And then there's depth. And oh boy, I hope you're ready for a headache, because this is where I'm probably going to lose about 89% of you. This is one of the most politically charged words in the gamer lexicon, which seems appropriate in that, like politics, the use of this word is usually dishonest and ideologically driven. But maybe you already have a definition of the word that you'd like to put on the table, so I implore you, my semantic masters, tell us what it is for a game to have depth. You have no fucking idea, do you? Oh, I'm sure something is floating around behind that disgusting cotton candy colored visor of yours, but what you probably don't have is a working definition. The truth is that depth is probably more solidly defined not by what it is, but by what it isn't. Let's think about what the term superficially means. You hear the word depth, and you'll probably think something along the lines of the overall skill level, but we've already got specific definitions of both physical and mental skills. Maybe it has something to do with the game's meta, except fuck you, I told you we don't use that word in this family! Do you want to go back in cryo storage? I will turn this warthog around! Okay, you're thinking, but depth has to involve some aspect of players being able to showcase their talent, right? And the answer is, not necessarily. The reality is that if this wasn't such a tricky concept, I wouldn't have even bothered making a video about it. The idea of depth in a game is lauded, and why wouldn't it be for all its gray, mushy implications of interesting gameplay? But here's the straight fact. Depth in a video game is basically just how much stuff it has. More specifically, a good working definition of the concept of depth would be a complex, multi-tiered system of controllable and/or static gameplay elements that create a fluid synergy through which the player is able to enact many different, distinct, and legitimately effective approaches to challenging his opponent. Or more practically, it's basically just a game with a lot of counters and/or style options. Now, one might think that hearing the phrases multi-tiered and synergy would cement the idea that such a game would be exploding with skill, but that's not necessarily the case. Skill and depth are not married concepts. They're more like friends with benefits, and sometimes at the end of the night, depth is like, can you leave? The best example I can come up with somewhere else in the gaming sphere is one of my favorite games of all time, Killer Instinct. More specifically, Killer Instinct 2. I love everything about this game. The character design, the music, the violence, the speed, the complex move system, the cylindrical breasts, everything. And yet, KI2 isn't really held in terribly high regard by the fighting community. It's not loathed or anything, it's just never exactly been high up on EVO's priority list, though I can't speak for the new one as I haven't played it. But why, though? Part of it might have something to do with the fact that Killer Instinct was commonly viewed as Street Fighter's annoying plastic pants wallet chain wearing younger brother who tried to get attention by being edgy, but was never as cool in class as their friend Mortal Kombat. If you look at KI2 on the surface, it looks like one of the most well-developed fighting games of all time, certainly at least for the time period in which it was released. The combo system is dripping with possibilities. All the combinations of openers, auto doubles, and finishers to go along with the rock, paper, scissors counter and breaker functions makes for almost infinite approaches. Then you have the super system, shadow moves, linkers, manual and pressure doubles, throws and throw reversals, parry and pop-up moves, air doubles, sped up and slowed down finishers, ultras and ultimates. Look at all this fucking awesome shit As far as actual deliberately programmed complexity goes, this is one of the deepest fighting games I've ever seen. However, if you take a closer look under the hood, you can start to notice some problems. First of all, almost none of KI2's techniques involve strict timing or precise input. The only one I can think of is throw reversals, which must be performed within the first frame of an opponent's throw. Other than that, you can pretty much mash together the entire button sequence of a combo with almost no regard for timing or sloppy stick work. In fact, this is often how sped-up combo finishers are performed. KI also has cheap juggles that last for days, especially if the easy juggle option is switched on. Oh yeah, and there's also an easy breaker option. You thought you were gonna finish that combo? Nah. The super bar fills up way too quickly with respect to some of the things you can do. There are several characters with unfair charge moves, which are once again not timing dependent, enabling them to attack within the first frame of availability after blocking with basically no effort expended, which is a 50-50 on a high or low attack. There's also no way to effectively engage an opponent from any decent distance without jumping in or performing an opener move that can be easily countered. More developed games have started including dashing, whereas KI2 went balls to the wall on movesets but not on movement options, creating somewhat stagnant gameplay between competent players. And then there's just a smattering of stupid shit like Saberwolf's Ultimate, where all you do is hold B. That's it. That's all you do. You just hold the fucking B button and wait for your opponent to move. Ugh. So what does this mean? KI2 definitely has the framework to be considered a game with exceptional depth. However, because of certain characteristics, that depth does not come with a wide skill disparity. It's certainly depth by our working definition, but its depth lacks substance. So while there is plenty of stuff that you can do, none of it is very hard, and as a result, the meta, yes, the actual meta, starts to suffer. Okay, great, Lemon, but does this actually translate back to Halo? Yes, it does. Look at Halo 1. Almost everything in that game is hard to do. The pistol is hard to use, the sniper is hard to use, nading weapons and power-ups is hard to do, timing weapons without an on-screen timer or a giant fucking kill me sign is hard to do, the niche weapons are difficult to use effectively, double meleeing is hard to do, negating fall damage is mildly difficult, grenade jumps are hard to do, giving your teammate a random is hard to plan for, even just landing a melee, much less accounting for momentum-based damage was hard. The problem is that where some people look at these things as barriers to entry, these and other things are what make CE a competitive masterpiece. Then Halo 2 came around, and everything, I mean everything, got fucked up beyond all rationality. The BR and the sniper are garbage easy, the niche weapons blow chunks, the power items are on dynamic timers and can't be nated, dual wielding promoted camping, just the whole thing was a floody mess.
Ha! Puns!
Then you have the melee glitches. And oh god, I apologize for having to bring the fucking migraines, but this gets right to the central point I'm trying to make. When it comes to Halo 2, you have two factions that are at eternal war with each other. Those that think the melee glitches were good for Halo 2, and those that think they were bad. Surprise, surprise, I think the melee glitches are straight shitsicles, but many other people claim that they add depth to the competitive experience. And based on what we just talked about, they're right. It does add depth, as the BXR and BXB both added another layer onto what could be done in close quarters combat. Just like our stipulations say, if it's stuff, it becomes depth. But also just like our stipulations say, it's fake depth just for the sake of being deep, like your middle school poems where you wrote the word blood with a red pen. They come with a multitude of problems, the worst of which is that they are fucking easy button. Not only is the melee system in Halo 2 complete garbaggio hotel with respect to lunge and consistency, the button combinations are also supremely simple and, much like our Killer Instinct, not terribly respectful of timing. The BXR even has the distinction of being a glitch you can't even do if you shoot at your opponent first, so in that sense, you get punished for having superior reaction time. Sorry folks, no meta cheese on this shit sandwich, because this completely ruined close quarters combat by making it a bad idea to chase and try to finish your kills. The depth came without the skill to back it up. Is a last-ditch technique you can pull out of your ass to save yourself necessarily a bad thing? Of course not. If it's actually last ditch. You can blame a lot of the systemic effects of this on factors such as long kill times, but the fact remains that sometimes the melee glitches were a first resort, and that's a problem. Now you would think that there would be a great opportunity for fans of Halo 2 to understand a little more about the nature of depth and skill with the double shot, one of the game's only redeeming qualities, but this is ultimately how I learned that the Halo community is basically the Borg. Why don't people talk about this more? It's a huge staple example of a game mechanic that allows you to rise above your opponent based on your own merit rather than the random chance that you chose the right option. It's difficult to pull off, it's highly situational, and it has a large risk-reward discrepancy. It's the epitome of depth and skill working together. It's right there in front of your face. You can grab it. It's real. It's waiting for you.
But you don't want it, do you? No. You don't want a competitively deep Halo, because wreck farming and storm rifle corner camping for you are the ephemeral drug that touches on those pleasure centers that life has long left ravaged, while short kill times and no radar is like the ugly taste of methadone pulling you back into the painful lucidity of the real world. For you, it's always been better to not know than to bear the disappointment of realizing you're just not good enough. The truth is that Achilles' armor reminds you of that high school championship you never won, or that promotion you never got. But you were paralyzed by the sacrifice and the commitment. Now all that's required of you to succeed is the continuation of your dull, lethargic existence. But the reality is that getting that kill-tacular with the Nornfang won't alert anyone to the fact that you're even still alive. And it will only drag you down deeper into the crushing singularity of your own catatonic longing.
I'm sorry. I don't know where I was there for a second. Skipping over a few games that I don't have the mental constitution to take on, we arrive at the present day with Halo 5. Now, disregarding a lot of factors, such as sandbox construction that have more to do with the optimization of the Halo experience, something I may do a future video on, what's the verdict on all the eccentric crapola that they stuffed into the series? Thruster, not hard. Clamber, not hard. Slide, not hard. Charge, not hard. Ground pound, not hard. Sprint thrust clamber, not hard. I mean, Christ almighty, they actually patched out the stuff that was mildly difficult to pull off in Fast Fall and Super Slides. So fucking thanks for that, assholes! None of this stuff is difficult to pull off, and not only that, you don't suffer any kind of punishment for attempting them. If it's not hard, it's not deep.
That's what she said!
At least not in the meaningful sense that we're speaking of. Then you have the weapons. Sniper, not hard. BR, not hard. DMR, not hard. Automatics, not hard. Shit, the only reason the pistol is hard is because it has a gimped zoom and the aiming is terrible. Almost nothing about Halo 5 is difficult, but boy does it have a lot of stuff. But when you have a lot of stuff and not a lot of skill, what you end up with is a whole lot of By giving physical skill the short end of the stick, you're hampering the ability of those who have superior physical tools to apply their talents in-game. Halo has always been a game that has been more about execution than strategy. It's like if you took the game of chess and said, well, we know chess requires zero physical skill and is strictly a mental game, but what if, and bear with me here, what if we made it so you were given only 2 seconds to complete each move? Wouldn't that be amazing for chess gameplay? No. Amazing is not the word I would use. It'd certainly be hilarious. But is that what you want Halo to be? Halo 5 Hilarians? But Lemon, you ask, doesn't the mental skill required to know when to time a thrust make it a skillful addition to the game? And I would say, yes, that's correct, if mental skill was actually a component of the game's mechanics, but it's not. Mental skill rests entirely with the person playing the game. It's not a function of the game itself. There is absolutely no meaningful difference between a thrust and a good strafe with respect to juking your opponent out, because the onus of timing and intelligent application is something only the player can create within the game. Halo 1 doesn't have thrust, but it does have a good strafe, and you can see a lot of smart dodges in high-level gameplay. It's just far more subtle, which is something Halo fans apparently have no sense of. If Halo 1 is Jonathan Swift, then Halo 5 is Dane Cook. The mental skill required to know the precise moment to use thrust is exactly the same or no more valuable than the mental skill required to know exactly how to shake an opponent's aim with a well-timed strafe. The point is that the mental skill gap is not created by the game, it's created by the players, and ironically, almost paradoxically, mental skill becomes more apparent the less convoluted their toolbox is. And while you can't really artificially increase the mental skill in a game, you can absolutely do work to destroy it. And what's the easiest way to accomplish that? By stuffing your game with a bunch of redundant features that are simple to execute, have almost no use limit, and involve almost no drawbacks. To bring it all together, skill and depth are not automatically intertwined. Depth is merely a multiplicative formula based on how many options a player has, which creates layers of opportunity but not necessarily layers of skillful engagement. Literally anything you add to the game increases the depth. Not everything increases the skill gap. The easiest piece of proof that I can offer to you to show this is to show the fact that everyone can perform every single one of Halo 5's techniques. There are no techniques that are too difficult for the layman to perform. That's not skill. You can drop a fucking warthog in the middle of lockout and that adds a layer of depth to the game, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a complete gameplay non sequitur. Any competent game designer will tell you that adding depth is not some trivial, off-the-cuff decision that you just do to include some more bright lights and flashing colors in your game. It's something that has to involve a careful analysis of your game's strengths and weaknesses and its primary skill focus in order to best create an experience that is both fun and competitively viable. If you add a feature to a game that you know is going to be played in tournaments, you have to ask yourself, what skill is this feature catering to, and what the interplay between it and other features and game variables will look like. Now, I mean, if you just don't give a shit, then that's fine too, but it's just a wee bit curious that Microsoft is throwing $2 million into a global Halo tournament. And yet they designed a game that has very low competitive capacity. That or they just threw money at the problem as a distraction. Regardless, the reason this video was made was only to drive a wedge between the concepts of skill and depth, and show that you cannot argue that a game's depth alone is a redeeming factor in its worthiness to be put on the tournament circuit. You need the individual elements of the game to be up to par if you want the whole product to be healthy, and Halo 5's competitive capacity is on the verge of multi-organ failure. As always, if you find Halo 5 fun, then good for you, and keep doing what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with enjoying something for what it is, which is why I don't really harp on Warzone's gameplay. Microtransactions and development priorities are another thing entirely. But if you're the kind of person whose interest would evaporate completely if thrust was disabled when you got shot, or lunge assist was removed from Spartan Charge, well, have you ever thought about what bleach tastes like?